Picture this. It is December 31st, 1975. You're standing in a finished basement in suburban Ohio, and the air is thick with a haze of blue-gray cigarette smoke that clings to the fibers of your burnt orange shag carpet. The room vibrates with the low hum of conversation and the tinny audio of a television set encased in a massive wooden console. Outside, the snow is piling up against the drafty windows, but down here, the temperature is rising, fueled by body heat, laughter, and the distinctive smell of sterno fuel burning under a fondue pot. You're wearing a shirt made of 100% synthetic Chiana nylon that feels slippery against your skin, and your feet are aching in platform shoes, but you wouldn't be anywhere else. This image, the wood-paneled sanctuary of the American middle class, is the quintessential snapshot of the decade. But strip away the Instagram filter of modern memory, and you find a reality that was far more complex than just disco balls and peace signs. For the people living through it, this New Year's Eve wasn't a retro theme party. It was a momentary escape from a world that felt like it was spinning off its axis. The headlines were screaming about stagflation, the gas lines of the energy crisis were still fresh in collective memory, and the political hangover of Watergate was a dull throb in the national consciousness. Yet, in living rooms from Sacramento to Scarsdale, the party went on. The domestic celebration of the 1970s was an exercise in brown on brown. If you scan the room, everything seems to be dipped in earth tones: avocado green, harvest gold, and chocolate brown. The furniture was heavy, often upholstered in scratchy plaid or sticky vinyl that made a distinct peeling sound when you stood up. This was the era of the rec room, a dedicated space for leisure that signaled you had made it to the middle class, even if inflation was eating away at your paycheck. The centerpiece of the evening, before the ball dropped, was invariably the buffet table. To the modern eye, a 1970s party spread looks almost like a dare. We are talking about the golden age of gelatin. There were towering, jiggly molds of lime jello, suspending fragments of carrots or pineapple, sitting unironically next to a platter of cold cuts rolled into tight cylinders. But the true star was the fondue set. It was the it item of the decade, a bubbling cauldron of cheese or oil that required a certain amount of danger to operate. Guests would crowd around, stabbing cubes of French bread with color-coded long forks, hoping not to drop their prize into the communal pot, a party foul that would earn jeers from the crowd. If you weren't dipping bread into cheese, you were likely eating a cocktail weenie simmering in a slow cooker filled with a murky sauce made of grape jelly and chili sauce, a sweet and savory combination that defined the palate of the era. And to wash it down, it wasn't craft cocktails, it was Schlitz or Miller High Life, pulled from a styrofoam cooler, or perhaps a glass of sickly sweet Mateus Rose or Blue Nun wine. If the host was feeling fancy, there might be a punch bowl, a sugary concoction spiked with whatever spirits were on hand, usually resulting in a headache that would last well into January 2nd. The fashion at these gatherings was loud, unapologetic, and highly flammable. The 1970s was the decade where comfort was sacrificed for style, and natural fibers were abandoned for the miracle of polyester. Men sported wide lapels that reached halfway to their shoulders and pants that flared aggressively at the ankle. Women wore maxi dresses in psychedelic prints or high-waisted trousers that emphasized the silhouette. The room was a sea of geometric patterns and double-knit fabrics. It was a tactile experience. The clothes didn't just look different, they felt different, smoother, hotter, and heavier. You could hear the swish-swish of pant legs rubbing together as people moved to the music. And what was the soundtrack? In the early 70s, the stereo might be playing the soft rock of the Carpenters or the folk twang of John Denver. But as the decade wore on, the beat picked up. By 1978, if the old folks weren't looking, someone might throw on the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack, turning the carpeted floor into a makeshift dance floor. However, the undeniable hearth of the New Year's Eve ritual was the television. In a time before smartphones or streaming, the TV was the only clock that mattered. For the first half of the decade, the older generation still held the remote, tuning in to CBS to watch Guy Lombardo and his Royal Canadians. Lombardo was Mr. New Year's Eve, a tradition stretching back to radio days. His music was schmaltzy and slow, a black and white relic in a technicolor world. But a shift was happening. In 1972, a young, impeccably coiffed man named Dick Clark launched New Year's Rockin' Eve on NBC, later ABC. He wasn't broadcasting from a ballroom. He was in Times Square. He wasn't playing big band waltzes. He was featuring Three Dog Night and Blood, Sweat, and Tears. This created a distinct generational divide in the living room. The parents wanted the comfort of Lombardo's Auld Lang Syne. while the teenagers and young adults wanted the energy of Clark. It was a cultural tug-of-war played out over the channel dial, symbolizing a nation in transition. As midnight approached, the mood would shift. The cynicism of the era, the complaints about gas costing a whopping 55 cents a gallon, or the price of coffee skyrocketing, would temporarily fade. People would grab their noisemakers, cheap tin clickers and paper horns manufactured in Taiwan. They would locate their spouses or crushes. The countdown wasn't a digital display on a phone. It was a collective chant, synchronized with the mechanical falling of a ball on the TV screen. When the clock struck 12, the room would erupt. It was a moment of chaotic, unpolished joy. For a few minutes, amidst the haze of smoke and the smell of cheap champagne, the hardships of the 1970s dissolved. There was kissing, there was the off-key singing of a Scottish folk song most people didn't know the words to, and there was a genuine analog connection between neighbors and friends, huddled together in a wood-paneled basement, hoping that next year might be just a little bit easier than the last. While the suburbs were dipping fondue forks in quiet basements, the city centers were vibrating with a very different energy. If the living room was the heart of the 1970s New Year, the nightclub was its adrenaline-soaked brain. By the late 70s, the me decade had fully embraced the culture of the discotheque, transforming New Year's Eve from a family holiday into a high-stakes event of social posturing and hedonistic release. In cities like New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, the night belonged to the beat. Specifically, the relentless four-on-the-floor thump of disco that sat at a heart-pounding 120 beats per minute. At the epicenter of this cultural earthquake was Midtown Manhattan. But before you could get in, you had to get past the velvet rope. This was a new phenomenon, the idea that New Year's Eve wasn't for everyone, it was for the chosen. Inside a club like Studio 54, which opened in 1977 and immediately defined the era's excess, the atmosphere was a sensory assault. The air didn't smell like pine needles or roasting turkey. It smelled of poppers, expensive musk cologne, sweat, and cigarette smoke so thick it caught the strobe lights like physical beams. The heat was oppressive. Bodies packed into tight spaces, a friction of silk shirts and Halston dresses. It was a kaleidoscope of race, class, and sexuality, all democratized by the dance floor, but strictly segregated by the doorman. Here, a nobody from the Bronx could dance next to a Vanderbilt, provided they looked fabulous enough. But step outside those gilded doors, and you were met with the biting, cold reality of 1970s urban America. This is the part of the story the movies often gloss over. New York City in the 1970s was not the sterile, tourist-friendly playground of today. It was a city on the brink of collapse. In 1975, the President of the United States had essentially told the city to drop dead when it asked for a federal bailout to avoid bankruptcy. To celebrate New Year's Eve in Times Square in the 1970s was an act of defiance, or perhaps insanity. The crossroads of the world was gritty, dangerous, and undeniably electric. The neon signs didn't advertise Broadway family musicals. They buzzed and flickered for peep shows, adult bookstores, and grindhouse theaters playing kung fu flicks or exploitation films. Steam rose from the manhole covers, mixing with the exhaust of massive yellow checker cabs that rattled over the potholes. The crowd that gathered at One Times Square wasn't the sanitized, penned-in audience we see on TV today. It was a chaotic, organic mass of humanity. There were no heavy security checkpoints, no metal detectors, and very few police barriers. You simply showed up and pushed your way toward the center. Muggers worked the perimeter, pickpockets worked the center, and police officers, often underpaid and overworked, did their best to keep the lid on a boiling pot. And yet, there was a magic in that grime. High above the trash-strewn streets sat the ball. In the 70s, it wasn't a crystal geodesic sphere controlled by microchips. It was an industrial relic, an aluminum frame weighing hundreds of pounds, rigged with standard incandescent light bulbs. It looked less like a diamond and more like a glowing apple, a nod to the city's nickname. It had to be lowered by hand by a crew of guys pulling a rope, like sailors hoisting a sail. It was mechanical, analog, and prone to error. Down on the street, Dick Clark was fighting to change the narrative. Standing on a riser, shivering in a thick overcoat, he was the bridge between the terrifying reality of the street and the safety of the American living room. When the cameras rolled, he framed the chaos as excitement. He turned the grit into atmosphere. He sold the idea that despite the graffiti, the crime waves, and the economic despair, America was still a place where people could come together to cheer for the future. As the final seconds ticked away, 10, 9, 8, the roar of the crowd in Times Square was different than the polite applause of the Guy Lombardo generation. It was a guttural, primal shout. It was the sound of a population that had survived a brutal year of inflation, gas shortages, and urban decay, screaming their existence into the cold night air. When the ball hit the bottom and the 197X sign lit up, often with a burnout bulb or two, the celebration was raucous. Strangers kissed strangers, a risky move in a pre-sanitized world, and cheap sparkling wine was sprayed onto polyester coats. For a moment, the disco queens in the club and the shivering tourists in the square shared the same timeline. The 70s were hard. The coffee was expensive, the cities were crumbling, and the future was uncertain. But on this one night, amidst the neon and the grime, the noise was loud enough to drown out the worry. Looking back at the 1970s New Year, we see a stark contrast to our modern, ultra-managed celebrations. We have traded the danger and the grime for high-definition safety and LED precision. We gained a Times Square that is family-friendly and a countdown that is synchronized by satellites, but we lost the raw, uncurated texture of the night. There was a certain vitality in that brown-on-brown world, a sense that the party wasn't a product being sold to us, but something we had to build ourselves, using a fondue pot, a radio, and each other to keep the cold at bay.